If these guys block this kind of deal, we're going to get out of this game entirely. So just from the horse's mouth, what I'm telling you is you're going to see a pall come over the early stage venture financing landscape, because a lot of these guys that are crossover investors that own a lot of these public biotech stocks that also fund the private stocks will change their risk posture if they can't make money. That's just the nature of capitalism.
In his most recent podcast, Chamath Palihapitiya shares his opinion regarding high inflation rates, the stock market, the crypto market, and the Fed.
Chamath, you did say that this would happen 2 months ago, and here we are 2 months later, and exactly what you said would happen is in the process of happening. Regulation, licensing, and regulatory capture.
Sam went a little further than I sketched out a few months ago, which is that he also said that it may make sense for us to issue licenses for these models to even be compiled. And for these models to actually do the learning. And I thought that that was really interesting because what it speaks to is a form of KYC, right? Know your customer. And again, when you look at markets that can be subject to things like fraud and manipulation, right? Where you can have a lot of bad actors, banking is the most obvious one. We use things like KYC to make sure that money flows are happening appropriately and between parties that where the intention is legal. And so I think that that's actually probably the most important new bit of perspective that he is adding as somebody right in the middle of it, which is that you should apply to this agency to get a license to then allow you to compile a model. And I think that that was a really interesting thing. The other thing that I said, and I said this in a tweet just a couple of days ago, is I'm really surprised actually where this is the first time in modern history that I can remember where we've invented something, we being Silicon Valley, and the people in Silicon Valley are the ones that are more circumspect than the folks on Wall Street or other areas. And if you gauge the sentiment, the hedge funds and family offices right now are just giddy about AI. And it turns out if you look at their 13Fs, they're all long NVIDIA and AMD. But if you actually look at the other side of the coin, which is the folks in Silicon Valley that's actually making it, the rest of us are like, hey, let's crawl before we walk, before we run.
And you're pro-regulation. Can you just highlight for me at least what you think, the commercial reason is to do that? How do you benefit from that? Like, not you personally, but generally, like, where does benefit arise?
I think that certain people in a sphere of influence, and I would put us in that category, have to have the intellectual capacity to see beyond ourselves and ask what's for the greater good. I think Buffett is right. 2 weeks ago, he equated AI to nuclear weapons, which is an incredibly powerful technology whose genie you can't put back in the bottle, whose 99.9% of use cases are generally quite societally positive, but the 0.1% of use cases destroys humanity. And so I think you guys are unbelievably naive on this topic, and you're letting your ideology fight your common sense. The reality is that there are probably 95 billion trillion use cases that are incredibly positive. But the 1,000 negative use cases are so destructive, and they're equally possible. And the reason they're equally possible, and this is where I think there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty here, is we don't even know how transformers work. The best thing that happened when Facebook open sourced Llama was also that somebody stealthily released all the model weights.
Yeah.
Okay, so
explain
I don't think
a little bit for a neophyte what we're talking about here. So there's the model and there's the weights.
Think about it as it's a solution to a problem. The solution looks like a polynomial equation. Okay, let's take a very simple one. Let's take Pythagorean theorem. X squared plus y squared equals z squared. Okay, so if you want to solve an answer to a problem, you have these weights, you have these variables, and you have these weights associated with it. The slope of a line, y equals mx plus b, okay? What a computer does with AI is it figures out what the variables are, and it figures out what the weights are. The answer to identifying images flawlessly turns out to be 2x plus 7, where x equals this thing. Now take that example and multiply it by 500 billion parameters and 500 billion weights, And that is what an AI model essentially gives us as an answer to a question. So even when Facebook released Llama, what they essentially gave us was the equation, but not the weights. And then what this guy did, I think it was an intern apparently or somebody, he just leaked the weights so that we immediately knew what the structure of the equation looked like. So that's what we're basically solving against. But we don't know how these things work. We don't really know how transformers work. And so this is my point when I think you guys are right about the overwhelming majority of the use cases, but there will be people who can nefariously create havoc and chaos. And I think you got to slow the whole ship down to prevent those few folks from ruining it for everybody.
In the context of what we're talking about, that models are becoming smaller and can be run on the edge, and there's obviously hundreds and thousands of variants of these open source models that have, you know, good effect and perhaps compete with some of these models that you're mentioning that are closed source. How do you regulate that? How do you, and then they sit behind an application and they sit behind tooling. Yeah.
I think in order for you to be able to compile that model to generate that initial instantiation, you're still running it in a cluster of thousands of GPUs.
But let's say we're past that.
You can't be past that. We're not past that yet. Okay. We don't have 5 million models. We don't have all kinds of things that solve all kinds of problems. We don't have an open source available simulation of every single molecule in the world, including all the toxic materials that could destroy humans. We don't have that yet. So before that is created and shrunk down to an iPhone, I think we need to put some stage gates up to slow people down.
What do you mean by those stage gates? Yeah.
I think you need some form of KYC. I think before you're allowed to run on a massive cluster to generate the model that then you try to shrink, you need to be able to show people that you're not trying to do something absolutely chaotic or havoc creating.
FTC's claim is that by giving Amgen this large portfolio of drugs that they're buying from Horizon, it's going to give them more negotiating leverage and the ability to do more of this drug blocking that they do with insurance companies and other payers in the drug system. So they're trying to prevent pharmaceutical drug price inflation, and they're trying to increase competition in their lawsuit. So I felt like it was a fairly kind of compelling case. I'm no lawyer on antitrust and monopolistic practices and the Sherman Act, but this was not, sorry, let me just say, this was not an early stage biotech risky deal that they're trying to block. This is actually a mature company with $4 billion in revenue and $1.5 billion in EBITDA.
I understand. I read it too, but 2 comments. It is because the people that traffic in these stocks are the same ones that fund these early stage biotech companies. And I talked to a bunch of them and they're like, if these guys block this kind of deal, we're going to get out of this game entirely. So just from the horse's mouth, what I'm telling you is you're going to see a pall come over the early stage venture financing landscape, because a lot of these guys that are crossover investors that own a lot of these public biotech stocks that also fund the private stocks will change their risk posture if they can't make money. That's just the nature of capitalism. The second thing is Lina Khan did something really good about what you're talking about this week, actually, which is she actually went after the PBMs. And if you really care about drug inflation and you follow the dollars, the real culprits around this are the pharmacy benefit managers. And she actually launched a big investigation into them. But this is what speaks to the 2 different approaches. It seems that unfortunately for the FTC, every merger just gets contested for the sake of it being contested. Because I think that if you wanted to actually stop price inflation, there are totally different mechanisms. Because why didn't you just sue all the PBMs? Well, there's no merger to be done, but you can investigate and then you could regulate. And I think that that's probably a more effective way. And the fact that she targeted the PBM says that somebody in there actually understands where the price inflation is coming from. But I don't think something like an Amgen Horizon, because what I think will happen is all the folks will then just basically say, well, man, if these kinds of things can't get bought, then why am I funding these other younger things?
Yeah, but Chamath, we're just not seeing a lot of the younger stuff get blocked. I don't think we've seen any attempts at blocking speculative portfolio acquisitions or speculative company acquisitions. So
I think these guys are getting caught up in the dollar number, you know?
Yeah.
So I think the problem is they see 28 billion. They're like, we need to stop it.